Hello everyone, today we talk about the Italian commune's involvement in the Crusades, which is one of those topics that basically once you start you never know when it's gonna end because it's really massive. And today we approach it simply from the perspective of the Crusader fleet, right? And therefore the Italian involvement chiefly through their ships, ships of their maritime republics, and partly their military involvement in the Crusade as well. And I made a video about, I think, the Castilian fleet between the 13th and 14th century. I will expand on naval history in the future of the Middle Ages, but not only. And we have already observed the importance that the Italian navies had in throughout all low medieval history, essentially, in effectively providing the actual fleets, the actual naval military support, sometimes and actually on a regular base, to these rising feudal monarchies, especially in Western Europe, and their involvement basically at every level at this point in Western European warfare, not just because of this strictly material help, but just also because of their financial involvement. As you know, in medieval history, basically, we don't have a sharp separation between the military and the civilian side of the story. This is particularly evident when you look at naval technology in pre-Renaissance warfare fundamentally. Of course, there were certain ships that were kind of more or less designed or adapted to a more evident military role, but let's say that there was a relative ease in essentially transforming several ships into actual military vessels, depending on the occasion. This is very important because, as you know, the Italians basically monopolized almost completely the trade, the intercontinental trade between Europe and Asia, fundamentally Asia, Africa as well, and therefore they had this massive capabilities in disposing essentially of ships on a regular base, which was fundamentally unknown elsewhere, right? Even the largest powers at this time all over Europe, the Mediterranean, we're talking also about Islam, given we're talking about the Crusades, didn't quite have anything like a permanent fleet, right? Every once in a while there was the need essentially to largely support terrestrial armies by serving them logistically with supplies along the coastline, right? That was the major function essentially of fleets in the ancient in medieval world, right? And this was naturally occasional, right? Which means that ships were levied or built or actually lent, as in fact it would happen quite evenly in this case, and put together for these expeditions, and then once they were over, it was done, right? Just to make a simple example, strategically speaking, when we talk about the Egyptian fort to conquer Jerusalem during the 12th century, you realize that Egypt put up this fleet, which normally didn't have, right? Because they wanted to harass the Crusader ports, right? So this key logistical centers for the supplies to the Crusader states that arrived from Europe, and this went in parallel naturally with a lot of other operations such as piracy, right? You can't even clearly define who was, for example, Christian and Muslim in certain situations, and the whole thing was really very, very complicated. So that's actually why this is a big topic. And first of all, so you see that the main effort, of course, of the Ayyubids was to seize Jerusalem, right, which they would effectively accomplish at the end of the 12th century. Once they seize Jerusalem, right, it is the major center seat of the kingdom, of the homonymous kingdom, the largest Crusader power in the Near East. What they do is, okay, we got the big chunk, we've got Palestine, this major area that, you know, frankly, the Kingdom of Jerusalem had a hell of strategical potential that everybody says, oh no, they would have lost it anyway. Actually, the Westerners had an enormous strategic potential with the Crusades. They weren't at all anything like a faded enterprise, right? Of course, from their side in terms of political, social interests, and as we will see now, particularly even through the Italian perspective, that is essentially the one that was more involved with the contacts with those areas in the first place. Well, nobody really cared an enormous much. Of course, the Crusades are the most evident proof that it was really a good idea, telling you the truth, to go there and seize Syria and Jerusalem. Some of them, they still didn't, before doing that, they still didn't know fundamentally how it would have turned out. The First Crusade is a great thing, whatever you were to consider it, and an enormous achievement that, if you look at the strategical picture, it was very difficult, right? But there was all the interest there. The Silk Road ended exactly in the Syrian and Lebanese ports, and even Egypt was the next big target. At one point, with the French Crusade of Louis IX, Egypt began the target there, right? Also as a threat to Jerusalem itself. The idea is get rid of the Islamic rulers of Egypt. You can't keep all the Near East for yourself. It was actually a pretty good idea, and the fact that the Crusaders eventually failed is naturally due to a lot of factors that, however, do not really show us a deterministic picture for which, they were doomed, and they couldn't be bring to completion, let's say. But let's say that once the Ayyubids seize Jerusalem, fundamentally it's done. They don't need a fleet anymore, right? They don't need ships out there. They simply have the big terrestrial chunk, which is effectively what makes the difference at the time, and that's how they proceed up to Acre 1291, right, in taking from land all of these areas. But this was effectively a thing, because between Egypt and Palestine, the terrestrial routes are not the best ones. It's very tough grounds and environments. They're not easy, logistically speaking, to exploit. Hence, they need to have a fleet momentaneously to block places like Jaffa, so these major ports, etc. But once you get the big chunk of land, then you go by land, right? And this is the attitude, essentially, that all other powers had at the time. Like, it's not, I don't know, the Kingdom of France or the Kingdom of England or even Castile. They had kind of their own ships. They didn't quite have anything of that. Even the mean of levying these things was very inventive in many ways, and they usually essentially hired already what they found there, or they maybe sequestrated certain civilian ships for fitting them for military purposes, etc. But this was ships are a big expanse, right? And therefore you need them just when there is a threat of, you really need to essentially support, because that's the main function of ships, to support a land army operating on the coast, but also avoiding, of course, in part, certain raids, countering, devastating, because that was done on a regular basis. Like, it was done on land, right? Raiding, it was, think about the Great Chevauchée, right? But it was the same thing via sea, essentially. And consider also that at this time you can't effectively even put up a blockade, as we mean it since naval technology of Victorian times, right? You could more or less intercept enemy ships, enemy fleets. You kind of knew, like in the Mediterranean, everybody would know at that point. It went by sea, the various currents in the time of the year, along particular straits, and chokes. Certain places were, certain particular time, it was kind of more possible to intercept an enemy, right? But you can't effectively block an enemy traffic, right? It's like even the clash between the Venetian and the Genoese. At one point Venice wins, but it's not that Genoa is completely ousted of the eastern Mediterranean. They keep certain in their kind of in the Black Sea, that where effectively the Genoese mostly remain. But it's effectively very difficult to even stop enemy trade, raids, and so on. And the whole thing obviously was very, very blended. So the same is valid for the Crusader states, right? The Crusader states, if you look at an Antioch, for example, or Tripoli, they both developed essentially small fleets. And the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself had nothing like a permanent fleet on its own, right? They would have just a few ships that they would use in case of need, but that's not effectively, you don't need that even. You don't need to spend all this money for something that, as we will see now, you can essentially lend from someone else in certain circumstances. This is all the more interesting considering that there were operative arsenals at this time, such as at Tyre and Acre. Once in 1182, 33 ships were raised, probably including Italian merchant vessels in port at the time. And that's the key for understanding that there were always ships of some kind there. It's just that they didn't belong to the kingdom in itself, right? We also know of other systems for levying ships that were fundamentally secondary to the rest, of course, of terrestrial forces that were the single most important thing that the Crusader states normally were chronically in shortage of in the first place. But, for example, in 1232, we know that there were money thieves being paid out to the poulains of the coastal cities for fitting out armored ships, which means that essentially these lower grade feudatories, if we can call them effectively in this way, were paid a certain amount of money. At this point, we're in the 13th century, there's much more money circulating, so even thieves are certain times just nominal. You don't have to think of the actual piece of land or infrastructure, but literally the money in itself, right? They were paid for these guys for building ships, right? Which we know probably didn't have much of a structural impact, but still evidently was functional to something. And when it came, however, to the necessity of levying a fleet, of course, the kings of Jerusalem depended principally on the Italian communes, as well as the military orders telling the truth for naval support. This is very interesting because, the orders had a hell of military on their own. They were scattered basically everywhere in Europe. Like, they had this massive logistical... They were extremely wealthy in the first place, especially the Templars. And they had essentially an organization in itself. Imagine from having houses from Scotland to Jerusalem, all throughout Europe and the Mediterranean, and therefore you know how to field ships. But not even these effectively, these orders had kind of a large amount of ships, right? The orders by themselves essentially maintained both transports and galleys, right? And we know that in a naval engagement during the siege of Tyre in 1187, there were 17 galleys manned by the Hospitallers and the Templars, right? While other powers, such as, for example, the Kingdom of Cyprus in the 13th century, relied on Italian ships, usually the Genoese, right? So, talking more specifically about the Italian communes instead, you find that their availability of ships was much larger, was really structural. For anyone interested, I made at this point, I think 2 or 3 videos on the Italian Maritime Republic, so if you're interested, I won't be repeating myself now. You can use those as a useful introduction to really make you understand why this was possible. Why is that the city-states on the coasts of Italy, basically all over Italy, chiefly in the center and the north, but even the south had originally something, and that had this massive importance, not just throughout the Crusades, basically throughout all the low Middle Ages in the commerce in Mediterranean. We've already talked before about the monopolium of trade from the Levant to Europe that was in the hands of the Italians chiefly, but not exclusively, but overwhelmingly so, at least. And we have to think that the Italian interests and contacts with these lands, including the Byzantines, of course, but also the Muslim lands, was continuous, enormous. Like, we treat the Crusades as if, the Westerners at one point went in the Near East, then they stayed there a couple of centuries, they were thrown out. The Italians were there since before and kept remaining there afterwards. And for them, fundamentally didn't change a great deal. The Italians in this sense were quite clever because they never thought of creating a territorial state, like the Crusaders, mostly of French culture, essentially had founded, essentially exporting the feudal model in the Near East, but also, for example, in the Balkans when the Venetians and the French conquered Constantinople. And the French, we'll see it better later, but technically there was a contract. The Venetians were owed, like, I don't remember, I think 1/3, 1/4 of the land would be conquered. This was the pact, right? And the Venetians says, we are not interested in that. We just want the ports. Right, and this was an imminent strategic interest from that. Essentially, Italian maritime republics were thinking about one thing and one thing only, that is money. Right, they didn't give a damn about creating territorial states as such. There are a few exceptions in the sense that, of course, when Genoa, for example, expands, they start seizing chunks like, I don't know, like Corsica, or even parts of Crimea. But these were essentially, or the Venetians with Crete, right? There is a bit of territorialization in that regard, but it's essentially a colonization that remains fundamentally aimed at controlling the ports, the trade areas, right? And as you know, the Eastern Mediterranean was very, very advanced at the time. So we're talking about a great urbanization, right? These were all areas of ancient civilization since the times of the Greeks or the Phoenicians, right? They fitted into the broader Hellenistic Roman world, and during the Middle Ages, these structures had remained. Hell, during the Crusades, during these amphibious operations, sometimes the Crusaders kept holding fortresses that dated back to, I don't know, even in their base of Phoenician times, right? Because there is this great infrastructural continuity that, of course, we realize also when you talk about Middle Ages in comparison to the ancient world. Alright, so what the Italians do is that they don't really have to build even anything much more. Of course, there are important works of building. The Italians at this point are on the lead also in engineering, military engineering. In Europe, they're often credited, in fact, as the ones who took most technological advancements from the East, albeit I have a bit of a different opinion in the sense I think that the Westerners overall were, when they're able to do this, which definitely happens because there were lots of Eastern influences, but it's because essentially that they had already arrived at that level of advancement on their own. Like, take even the same Venetian fleets, right? By the 12th century, basically the Italians have come out without a kingdom, without an empire, but basically to have a larger military, technical, logistical capability, even by sea. The same Byzantine Empire basically starts relying almost exclusively on Venetian ships strictly for military purposes, leaving aside the completely uneliminable commercial interest that at that point was also keeping the Byzantine economy florid and alive, because the local business was very, very different from what was being developed in the West, and especially in Italy at the time. And this was blackmail, right? Nobody was doing anything for beneficence at the time, for charity, let's say. And this was all a constant blackmail, and in fact Italians basically took roots in these areas, occupying essentially certain quarters in the city ports that would become cities within cities ruled by Italians. There we had everything, their walls, they had their own port, their own warehouses, facilities, church, market, everything, right? And those were incredibly difficult at the time, even to dislodge, right? There were anti-Latin reactions, for example, in the Byzantine world. There were certain purges, for example. Lots of Latins, chiefly Italians at that point, were imprisoned, even killed and robbed, right? This actually happened all the time, also in other places, when especially local authorities needed to cash fast, but this couldn't go much ahead because they still needed the trade of those people, so there were kind of emergential situations. Paradoxically, these merchants would return and they would get even more privileges than before, with the difference that now they were a bit more angered and suspicious and hostile to local policy, and we know how that ended. That's in fact why a Venetian fleet conquers Constantinople with the French large Crusader army in 1204, right? And that's also very, very complicated. The history of the Fourth Crusade is very famous. It's often shouted as, yeah, look what the Westerners did to Crusader. But if you really look at the story of it all, and even what you realize that there were same Byzantines who were calling Crusaders there for making a coup d'état, the same Constantinople. Well, that's brutal, right? And disturbing, and it's a hell of a story, telling the truth, and also because that Crusades had started with truthfully with the best intentions of the Roman papacy. It wasn't at all like a pre-planned. Naturally, not even the Pope was particularly upset about the Caesar of Constantinople, but when he learned also what the Crusaders did there, right? And there are many important cultural differences as well within the same Westerners, like the kind of the French. Let's say the Crusaders began to to really dismantle the city that they didn't even have much of the competencies to rule right here, and they made massive damage, extensive damage. They eventually, how the Latin Empire ended. That was a pretty messed up thing. The Italians, the first thing they do is they come there, start bringing back all the treasures, all the riches, all the works of art back to Italy. It's extremely famous thing about the Quadriga that the Venetians brought back from Constantinople, dating from ancient time. There is all this great, even different orientation that makes you understand sometimes even why the Crusades were failure in the end, right? It was not a matter of idiotic decisions, as some put it. Like, yeah, okay, there were also pretty stupid things that were done, but I tend to look at history in a bit more of a comprehensive way. Single decisions are important, but if certain things happen in the first place, maybe the context at that point is a bit more interesting to frame, and definitely this was a great, we tend to see the low Middle Ages as a moment of great kind of progress in itself, especially from a strictly Western European perspective. But what happened in this world was very critical, was really brutal, and it triggered a set of results that eventually backfired a bit for everybody at the end of the day. But the point here is that the Italians were in the Near East, basically way before the Crusades. This is another thing we tend to overlook all the time, and not just the Italians. Even when we look at the Frankish mercenaries, heavy cavalry coming from usually French, Normans background. Before the first Crusade, it was plenty of there. It was full of Europeans in the Near East before the Crusades. They knew exactly what was there, and that partly explains, by the way, why they got there eventually too. And we know, since the 10th century, Venice frequented Alexandria, Egypt constantly. They had massive trade relations with the Muslims. It would keep going on, having the very same thing, even after the Crusades. We need to frame the Crusades in a much wider picture here, not just like as it's often presented. We went there at one point for no specific reason, but we were fanatics, and then we got kicked out of there, and then we kept licking our wounds back in Europe. No, it didn't happen like that. Especially the Mediterranean, when you study that was fundamentally largely an Italian lake at the time, and it would remain so for centuries and centuries. Like, if you look at the Royal Navy demanded to the officers who were sent in the 19th century to operate in the Mediterranean was a basic knowledge of Italian, because that's the language you would have to speak no matter where you went in the Mediterranean. That's what it was, because literally there's never been a break between these things. The Westerners have massively more influence than Mediterranean from Europe than the other way around. Right, that's also the other perspective. Often goes along with the Crusade, is that from Africa, from the Near East, we had just terrible waves of invasions and things. Have you an idea what was the demographic potential of places like North Africa or the Near East during the Saracen age, and which was already the one of Europe at the time? Do you know that basically there was a massive trade shift. So Europe began to export grain in countries like Egypt that these countries that had been exporting grain for Europe for centuries, at this time Europe basically starts exporting grain from them, usually from Sicily in the southern European areas. We have to flip a little bit certain ideas that we have, because our own civilization passed through these contexts. I mean, the Italians at this point were the ones who created banking, who created banknotes, fundamentally, accounting. They pioneered mathematics. And why? Because they were here. They were there all the time. Tunis, Alexandria, Constantinople. They were literally everywhere. And they remained there all the time. Other quite overlooked aspect of this story. Not only they went there, they're often searching for books, translating them, right? This is evident even in Spain, the famous translation school of Toledo, for example, where there were people actually from Lombardy or from southern France that went there studying, right? We're talking about the 12th century. So, evidently, the stereotype of the brute crusader that went there, discovering civilization, wasn't quite like that. These guys could translate that stuff because they were already advanced. Of course, a typical Belgian feudatory knight, let's say, was very different from, I don't know, a Venetian merchant, right? There are significant differences, as we were saying before. But Western Europe was largely all one block. It had striking homogeneous characteristics, and it was still the same thing, also because you could easily find a Lombard merchant in Belgium at the time. So we need, again, to think over and over this stuff, and to realize the deep roots that even improvement of naval engineering, of cartography, all passed through the Mediterranean. It was essentially a Western-dominated place. The same Crusades. We think at the Crusades, starting typically 1095, 96, right? What about, let's leave aside the Reconquista from the strictly just continental side of the story, right? Which is definitely very important. But look at what happened in Western Mediterranean during the 10th, the 11th century. Look at what happens in Sardinia, in Corsica, in the Balearic Islands. Look at the Genoese and Pisan fleets that arrive as far as the eastern Spanish coast to get rid of Saracen avamposts in there. These guys had cleared, all alone and completely autonomously, the Western Mediterranean from Saracen piracy. Look at the Normans that arrive in southern Italy. They conquer Sicily from the Muslims. Once again, all before the Crusades. So why do we start the Crusade just like canonically with the first one? We don't see what was going on all before it, what went on and kept going on, right? And I care about this because I feel that this whole picture is deeply overlooked, especially when you talk about the Crusades. Yes, the Crusades were objectively mostly like a feudal, largely French-dominated, but consistent, in fact, German, English, in partly Italian, of course, but there were so many other nationalities in this process. But we often don't see what moved all this, that logistically speaking, all gravitated around Italy, and the more it went on, and it basically depended on it. Look at trade at the routes of the Crusades. The first Crusade was all by land, essentially, or almost. By the Third Crusade, it would have been crazy to think to go to the Holy Land via land, right? It would all pass through the Mediterranean via ship, and who gave the ship? Who kept supplying the Crusader states? Well, it was basically Italy. There was no other continental European power. Basically, had the maritime naval capabilities to mount up expeditions of that measure, right? They didn't often even have the money to pay eventually the Italians who shipped them. That's how the Fourth Crusade went straight to Constantinople, because basically the Venetians said to the Crusaders, you know what, you don't have money to pay our ships. Well, okay, so why don't you help us seize Zara from Hungary, from the Hungarian king, who was a Christian king, of course. And that happens, and that's how the Venetians got Zara. So understand, this is very important. For example, France has this enormous work during the 13th century for opening a an access to the Mediterranean proper. Aigues-Mortes, right, becomes the port of the French Crusades. That's where from Louis IX launches his crusade. That thing, the French monarchy had not had that capability up to the previous decades because they hadn't still seized, inherited the southern French lands. They didn't have port facilities at that point. They had to build one, Aix-Noble, right? This is all very important because there is a geographical dimension here that can't be so easily overlooked. And aside from the military side of the story, of course, we see here, think about essentially the logistics here that of the Crusades is essentially as an Italian thing. It was Italian navies, Italian ships, Italian crews that put this all together. And more than this, right? More than this, because also on land, aside from a lot of Crusaders coming from, let's leave aside the Norman Kingdom of Sicily, of course, but there were lots of Crusaders coming from Lombardy, from Tuscany, from these places, just like it was done normally. But these were terrestrial powers, right? But if you look at cities like Genoa and Pisa that were, especially for the Crusades up to 1291, to which we stopped today, were essentially the most important ones, especially in the first phase. Well, these people rendered possible things including the capture of Jerusalem, right? The capture of Jerusalem in 1099 is possible because the Pisan mariners essentially chopped down their ships to build siege towers, which the Pisans are actually the first one to storm the walls of Jerusalem. So much that Godfrey of Bouillon engraves at the entrance of the city eventually, well, this belongs to the Pisans, because he had recognized what these guys had, and that his successor had that erased, because obviously he didn't want to arise particular pretenses from certain sides. But this was a real thing. If you look at the Crusades of the North, for example, the Germans, which is a mostly German-dominated thing, well, the Germans start do seemingly basically the same thing, right? The Hanseatic League largely develops exactly at that point, so you realize even in there that there's all a process of colonization that did require a massive logistical structure, right? And the Germans start building that. But at that point, the dominating mercantile force in Europe is the Italians. The Italians being immediately too poor in the Baltic, well, the Germans basically blocked them. They forbid the access to their markets to the Italians, because they knew that these guys would have gotten there and would have had a significant impact on how things would have evolved. So it was a world which there was a significant aggressiveness on the market that we can't maybe characterize a bit more emphatically, because otherwise, not even in the modern age, we can't talk in terms of certain types of capitalistic aggressiveness. But here it's the base of it. Like, these guys start start piling an enormous amount of wealth, right, which enables them even to have the ships, the actual material force that they eventually were put at disposal of the Crusader states, right? So an Italian maritime republic like Genoa, like Pisa, would normally have essentially tens and tens of ships available all the time. And these ships simply belonged to the local aristocracy that was heavily involved in basically everything in the city, including trade, right? These were the same families from which the same knights, for example, came, right? They would read French chansons de geste, would, I don't know, behave. They would be identical, essentially, even to those, and would be sometimes even the same guys who went to Crusades, right? But they paid for the development of ships, and ships were an investment, right? It's here the banking accounting starts developing, because these were all enterprises that were investing massively in these sea trades, right? They had this, they really, the tax of interests were quite high at this point, and they kept seeing that trade with the East was convenient. They already knew that, right? These were things went on since ever, the these forms were started essentially by by the Jewish merchants originally. Then the Italians come and become prominent. But evidently they see that it's convenient to start building more ships, and more ships, and these were starting also to be manned also by armored. I mean, it was plenty of troops mounted on them, because guess what? As soon as the Italians cleared the Western Mediterranean from Saracen and Piracy, they started fighting against each other, which was typical at this point, and therefore piracy, trade, war was literally the same thing, and this thing would explode literally in terms of massive investments, especially from a military point of view in the 14th century, which today we don't discuss. But earlier this time, you have developing in parallel with these fleets, naval engineering, development of effective missile weapons to crush enemy ships, crossbows that similarly had a massive development exactly in this play. Think about the Genoese crossbowmen. Similarly, this is usually linked with maritime warfare. I still have to. It's plausible actually, because it's something you find also during, I don't know, the Viking era in certain contexts. Makes you realize it was how important missile were during naval warfare, and they have this enormous amount of ships constantly, right? So what happened is that when there was a war, right? The city government simply said, look, we need a certain amount of ships to mount an expedition, right? And they simply sequestrated the ships, or better, basically the same people who needed to make war were the guys who were ruling the commune, right? The same families, the same aristocracy. They offered their ships, because war is nothing else but another investment, and it works all like this, all the time. Right. Also because when there is not war, there is trade. This is all what you all know, right? Think about even later times during the Renaissance, Venice and the Ottoman Empire fighting all, very frequently, but frequently meaning that there was a period of war, sometimes even very long, but there were even longer periods of peace in which the same enemies began to trade once again, because they both needed fresh air, and that was the best way to do that. And this is went on literally in every single place in the world, all the time in history, and will always be like that. There is no difference. Money is money. It doesn't matter where you come from, which religion you have, which political side your money is money, right? And it goes always like that. So to make you understand here the numbers that are quite important. For example, we have seen how. First of all, the Italians, especially during the 13th century, start becoming really a thing also from a general military point of view, right? They're second just to the military orders in Outremer in terms of military assets. After the loss of Jerusalem, right, that's it. These guys come with actual soldiers, not just marines, but sometimes even with armies to seize certain areas. So there was, first of all an establishment of exchanges during the essentially as soon as the Crusaders set foot in the Near East, they created their kingdoms. The Italians immediately start from the very early years of the 12th century to start negotiating with them, same way they had done with the previous rulers, and to establish this exchange for services rendered by Italian fleets in the capture, for example, of coastal cities. Right, there are many important military situations, for example, to conquer the coastal cities, right? With the only exception of Tyre and Ascalon, this all the coastal cities of the area, of the region, fall between 1100 and 1111, right? We're talking about 11 years, basically all the coastal cities are seized, right? And this through the support of Italian ships. This is very important because, as we were saying before, I didn't stress it enough, but the coastal city at this point in the Middle Ages, in Middle Ages, fortifications have an enormous impact, right? Before gunpowder, and also for actually a couple of centuries after gunpowder was introduced in Europe for military purposes, artillery is, artillery in general, pre-firearms and firearms are like is not a big deal effective, right? And sometimes you can't storm a fortification; you just have to wait months and months and months. When you besiege a coastal city, the main problem is you need a fleet to block it, because if you block it from land and the sea access is left open, you're besieging it for nothing, because the enemy is getting supplies, right? So in order to seize all these substantial urban centers, fortified centers on the Near Eastern coast, you need ships. Well, Crusaders do not have it. The Italians do. They made this deal. The Italians provide their ships. The guys from land with the armies besiege the cities, they blockade, and when the city falls, the Italians are rewarded with that quarter of theirs there, which incidentally is, I was telling you, it was a blackmail, because actually the Italians occupied exactly those areas that were the ones you had to blockade during the siege, right? Because they had the sea access, right? So it was particularly difficult at that point in many occasions to actually dislodge the Italians from these places, because medieval fortifications could be held by renowningly by an astonishingly few amount of people, right? But especially these ones could be resupplied via sea all the time. Until there was another fleet that could counter these Italian fleets, you couldn't do anything about it, almost, right? Of course, then you could still besiege it and try a way to capture them, but we're talking about huge amount of energies, of resources, and that's what a medieval siege basically is. So you don't start it just by, it's difficult. You have to block all around. You have to make major, works, etc. But once again, if you don't block these places from the sea, there's a few you can do. And the Italians, the only place they see is exactly the ones they have access from the sea. Now, that's clever. That's also why you understand why which was actually what had they already been doing with previous, with other political entities out there, right? And that at one point had seen even the inherent danger and threat, also because the Italians were quite unruly. They fought renownedly against each other. There were multiple quarters, and the Venetians, the Genoese, or the Pisans, they all hated each other guts, right? So sometimes these guys put to fire entire cities for their quarrels, and the local, the Sultan of Egypt, think about even the damage at that point that happens. But what do? You dislodge these guys, you kill the responsibles, you imprison the others, you sequestrate their goods, and then what do? You don't have those trade traffics, you don't have the tolls being paid. You need to reinstate these guys, because that's sap for your economy. You need that forcibly, right? So that's the blackmail I'm talking about. It was pretty damn effective, because these guys weren't dislodged by anyone. The Crusades began and stopped. There were local upheavals, new rulers, new dynasties. Italians are always there, whatever it happens. So that's really impressive. Another example, in terms of actual capability of how many ships the Italians were able to put together. For example, 40 Genoese ships. So we're talking just about the city of Genoa. So a single city that basically puts together what was an average kingdom military force in that context. We're talking about the beginning of the 12th century, right? 40 Genoese ships attended the siege of Jabail in 1103. 70 were at Acre in 1104, 60 at Tripoli in 1109, 40 Genoese and Pisan ships at this point at Beirut in 1110, and later as many as 100 to 130 Venetian ships at the siege of Tyre in 1124. So Venice is able to deploy 100 ships on its own. Just think of what this fundamentally means for the time standards. So as we've seen, such fleets had been supplied principally by the city-states of Genoa, Pisa, and at first to a lesser extent Venice too. So these are the largest Italian maritime republics that, in fact, even in Italy have basically knocked out all the others, and they will keep essentially working to knock out each other in the process, right? There are other minor centers, of course, but as we'll see also later, but they were more about trade, and usually they were part of the business of the larger cities. For example, even in 1284, when Genoa is able to crush Pisa in battle, well, Pisa still remains a big city, to crush a naval battle, like the greatest naval battle in medieval history, and Pisa doesn't fall as an economic power on its own. But they are basically obliged to go after Genoa in investments and everything, because at that point, aside from the fact that we're pretty close, right, and the Genoa took the chance to seize several even parts of the Tyrrhenian coast as a process, but there is this progressive, even structuring of the financial capabilities by putting a lot of more of interests together, right? Consider that these cities weren't like cut off from the rest of the world. There were many other cities who had their business in Italy, but they didn't have an access to the sea, right? So even these guys were necessary to export things. So they were all a bit on the same boat, we can say metaphorically. And there was a great financial power backing them. So that's also the reason why they made such a big amount of money. Not considering that objectively the same houses of the Crusader states dynasties were fundamentally tied to them first of all for shipping, secondly even for actual economy at home, because of course these people would always take contact with these cities to obtain something. It was all about money once again, but it was also very political, as you understand. Even very small changes in this regard, whichever was the situation, I don't know, with the papacy, with the emperor, well, this could make the single Italian maritime republic switch to one or another into being contrast with one, and they had their own logic. And as we will see, especially later, that's what effectively created the majority of problems, is that the same Italians were participating to the Crusades as Crusaders, but the city-states that regulated the logistics of it all, they still behaved on the base of their personal needs, right? So it was very important, what was happening, even within the same cities. I mean, there were always different factions struggling against one another. If there was a coup d'etat, the city would change side. We knew what would happen. This was dramatically important. If you had to ship an army from Germany to Sicily, as Frederick II had to do for Hohenstaufen, you need Genoa. There are not many other ways you can do that, right? And this changes dramatically all the strategy. I mean, what is happening in Europe was happening in the Near East, right? And it's really very meaningful. Naturally, the support of these fleets was paid by the Crusader states, right? Which could happen in different ways: actual cash, trade concessions, or loot, or actually all three together, because frankly these guys were doing whatever they wanted via sea, no matter what, right? These guys were constantly involved in piracy, warfare, whatever. Naturally, they had to be quite careful on their own regard, in the sense that even the Crusader states, yet they were a might to be reckoned with, so they had their own respect, but still they had a quite high political and strategical potential that made them strong in the very key points, right? The whole logistics of the Crusader states. As we have seen, the Italian maritime republics were promised also part of the besieged city. Often a third, right? That was the usual portion. The end product was the establishment of self-governing Italian communes in all the coastal cities. Um, each one of them was under a delegate of the central government, right, appointed its parent city in Italy. These were called either consuls or viscounts, right? And they actually, this Italian communes had for those time standards, a solid amount of centralization. Like a feudal power would simply say, okay, well, I give you some land and you rule it on your own. The Italian city-states at this point had a very efficient way to control what was going on. Even from the other side of the Mediterranean, right? They had a way to. They had several officials actually that were more or less in charge of the. Usually, these governors were entrusted with the civilian affairs, right? Mostly with trades. Then eventually there were actual military figures that were sent in force with the republic's troops to sometimes to repress rebellions, to enforce the law, things like these. So it was actually an efficient and functional governing system, differently from many other areas all around. And the if you look at just the amount of cities, for example, Genoa alone possessed such colonies in Acre, Antioch, Arsuf, Beirut, Caesarea, Jaffa, Jebel, Latakia, Saint Simeon, Tyre, and Tripoli. Right. Also, Venice had its own communes in the larger of these cities. Right. Both cities having actually quarters in Jerusalem too. Right. Jerusalem naturally is not on the sea, but you can imagine all the, as a market, right? That there was a commercial penetration anyway, and Jaffa that we have named in here was the main port of Jerusalem as well, controlled by the exports and imports via sea by the Genoese. Pisa as well had communes in Acre, Antioch, Botron, Latakia, Tripoli, and Tyre. And in addition, there were even Amalfitan communes. This is very interesting, Amalfi being conventionally considered the first Italian maritime republic in southern Italy. These were, it is true that southern Italy was kind of historically more urbanized and, let's say, projected towards the sea at least. Also for context, more continuity with the Byzantine government, etc., towards the east. And so southern Italian cities sometimes along the coasts develop more, even geographically also closer to the east, and they begin earlier to develop. The problem for them is that the Normans arrive, and when the Normans established their own feudal kingdom, several of these cities remain choked in their development, and therefore they basically regress, and instead the basically free communes of central and northern Italy expand, and they basically take their place in trade markets of the Mediterranean. But even during the Norman domination, of course, the coastal cities of southern Italy had some autonomy, right? And in fact, you find still here Amalfi, right? That had its own colonies in Acre, Latakia, and interestingly enough, here there weren't just Italians. There were even colonies from Marseille in southern France that technically at the time was part of Provence and hence of the Holy Roman Empire. Which had these colonies in Acre, Jaffa, Jebel, and Tyre. The Barcelonese began to appear here. You know that Barcelona, especially during the 13th century, would emerge even as a substantial competitor for especially Genoese trade in the Western Mediterranean, and which had at this point Barcelona has a colony in Tyre, right? And so this is normal in the sense that once again, yeah, there are kind of the major powers in here owning quasi-monopolium on the traffics with the East, but there are naturally a lot of other merchants that come there and try to make their part. And this tells you how flourishing these trades were at the time, and how remunerative they were. And what is interesting about these colonies, right? In Italian, they're called fondachi, which is a name that comes from the Arab, that at this time, before Italian, was effectively the lingua franca of the Mediterranean. Then there is the trade shift, and the Europeans take over in this sense, even linguistically we can say, but it was from funduk, which means warehouse, right? And this was the name, and in fact you find even today's that was named like the fundaco of the Germans, for example, in Venice, because there were all the German merchants at that point that came via land, but they had their own colony in Venice, so these were old models, also commercial organization and logistics that are important to remember. Just even urbanistically, I mean, archaeologically speaking, there are important remains of all these activities. We know even how the enormous amount of the volume of goods that was of the traffic in itself was immense at this point. Consider by the 13th century the Mongols have opened all the Asian routes. So basically at this point the Italians are pouring in China, and there's this dramatic moment of increase of fluidity of trade, etc. That from which naturally also these powers highly benefit from. The Polo family was from Venice, for example, and they went as far as China, seemingly. But what is interesting in general here is that all these local colonies, I call them colonies, but to make it simpler, had their own local organization. They had their militia, for example. So these militias sometimes did participate to the Crusader levies. Let's say, of course, there was a negotiation because these guys were not obliged to serve in the king's army. These were kind of autonomous powers on their own. They could muster a certain limited amount of troops. I don't think more than 500 men, right? But it was already something at the time, and you know the importance that Italians had in general during the Crusades. Think about, famously, probably most important, the peasant crossbowmen, the Battle of Arsuf, that Richard Lionheart uses in a dramatically effective way. They make this kind of rotation fire that, every guy was, the first line was shooting, the others were reloading, the others were preparing once again. So against Turkish cavalry, the crossbow is pretty damn effective in this repetition fire, and the Battle of Arsuf is in fact one of the greatest masterpieces of Crusader warfare, right, under Richard of England. And generally speaking, it's also the engineering competence in here that is often overlooked, right? You needed, as everybody who studies medieval siege warfare, for example, this immense amount of material to build stuff, right? There were certain areas in here that weren't even particularly rich in wood, for example. It's very famous at certain points, certain Crusaders expeditions in the Sinai area. They had difficulties to find the wood to build the siege tower, siege equipment. So it was vital even to have contacts with the Italian colonies, because in there you could find an enormous amount of stuff of competent people who knew how to build stuff, all the various instruments. That's an important asset. It's costly, but it's effective. So we have recorded before the role that the peasants had in the capture of Jerusalem. There are many other episodes. But the important thing, though, is that these communes were under no obligation to serve in the king's army of Jerusalem. Right? They could be called upon to help defend the cities in which they had their quarters, right? Which was the most, obvious thing, right? When these cities were threatened, the local garrisons would naturally join in the defense. Cities that were under naturally the local Crusader state control, right? So at that point they had kind of matching objectives, let's say, and they could support each other. Other times they could lend naval support, as we have seen, usually in exchange for extra privileges. And this happened chiefly in defense of the coastal towns. There was probably some policing in general, the coasts, patrolling and seeing, because as we were saying before, it was even difficult to predict enemy movements along the coast. I mean, yeah, generally speaking, if, I don't know, Egypt was mounting up a major naval expedition, like all the Mediterranean would know that. The merchants would know that. The spies would know that. These are big things, right? Nothing comes by surprise proper. But you may not know when that happens, in terms of which day, and since speed of communication is not immense, right, you have to be always in alert for potential movement. So naturally the same Middle Ages had quite sophisticated systems of communication, but mounting up an expedition is still something that takes time and deliberation and organization, and largely these fleets were kind of always ready for duty, right? And it's important as just the availability of it that probably makes the difference. In fact, major of clashes between the Crusaders, so if you think about the Kingdom of Jerusalem, it's essentially these Italian fleets against the Egyptian one, right? When they were trying to blockade certain ports, etc. So, and it's the typical naval warfare of the time. It happens also pretty much everywhere. We know, however, that there were Italian contingents often going along as allies in many offensive campaigns, and as mercenaries in others. Italians are a bit overlooked, indeed, in the fact that they were there, right? And if you today we don't talk about it, but aside from this Mediterranean character, for example, the major military orders that were largely kind of French, there were Europeans for every country, but there were the major nationalities, they were kind of French, Italian, Spanish, English, these things in here. They were quite multinational, but it's obvious that, once again, the logistical centrality of Italy rendered the presence of Italians quite of constant in every of these situations. There were many, as we were saying before, many Italian cities. I mean, people would simply go to the crusade, right? If today we're talking about Italians, chiefly talking about the Italic kingdom, so the center and the north, but naturally we can't exclude from the account the kingdom of Sicily. The Principality of Antioch is a creation of the kingdom of Sicily, with the Hauteville. Bohemond of Taranto was on Hauteville and therefore the Normans were expanding from southern Italy into this progressively, bit in Tunisia, bit in Syria with Antioch, etc. Always aiming, by the way, at the Byzantine Empire, and therefore we're talking about systems that at this point really revolve around the Mediterranean as actual powers. Think about even Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, when he is able, effectively and diplomatically, to recuperate Jerusalem during the 13th century. And, well, that can be considered an Italian expedition. Well, considering, Frederick II had its own German and Sicilian barons, and that's what they were. But it's really the cultural, the commercial, the penetration here that is really important at the same time. That's really where it remains rooted, and that's why we can't consider the Crusades as just like the end of Christian-controlled areas, aside from the fact that objectively the Christians maintained lots of territories all around. I mean, the same Italians in the first place, with colonies scattered all over Turkey, Greece, and Cyprus, with all these places that were there, right? But up to the Ottoman expansion in the 15th century, well, there was plenty of military orders. Even the same reconquests of the Byzantine Empire very important. There are lots of Europeans, of Western Europeans, chiefly, settling even as, essentially as feudatories for the Byzantine Empire. Think about the famous Aragonese Company of the Catalonians of Roger de Flor, that is literally this mercenary companies that creates an empire on its own across Turkey and Greece, and then eventually it's a mess, but for everybody involved. But there are always interference. Think about figures coming strictly from Italy, of Montferrat, for example. Montferrat was this small feudal state in northwestern Italy, and Montferrat at one point becoming even temporarily de facto kings of Jerusalem, and this was a tiny state, but they were allies with the Holy Roman Emperors. Traditionally, they were Ghibellines, and basically Montferrat, if you look at the time in the 12th century, the second half of the 12th century, under the time of Frederick Barbarossa, etc., Montferrat was crucial at that point, because it was really the tip of the balance of the whole system. You would say, there is a beautiful book by Magdaleno that is about this is an American historian talking about Michael I Comnenus, Byzantine Emperor. Well, that's a beautiful book that really shows you what the whole deal was in that mess of the time, in terms of relation between the Byzantine Empire, the Crusader states, the Armenians of Cilicia, with this situation in Europe. And you realize that this was between from the Channel to Palestine, this was a huge political system, was continuously destabilized, right? And even the switch of a tiny power like Montferrat, for example, was of an enormous impact for the whole system. Think about even Savoy, that was a French dynasty, but eventually expands into northern Italy. Well, they're famous, the expeditions of Amadeus of Savoy, even in the history of the Byzantine Empire during the 14th century. The Crusades didn't end with leaving aside Nicopolis or Varna that were aimed at halting the Ottomans in the Balkans. But think about all these Westerners, think about Boucicaut from France, from all these Western Europeans that kept going basically to the Eastern Mediterranean all the time as crusaders, and serving each other, having this nets of communications, of interactions, and all the raids from Cyprus under the Lusignan on Egypt, the Genoese involvement. I made a video, by the way, about it was the Cypriot Navy, actually in the 14th and 15th century, not today's time span, but that really shows you how multicultural even it meant, as for all these different backgrounds and nationalities and even religions and confessions. That world really was. And before the compaction brought by the Ottoman conquest, these areas were dramatically permeable. Like the idea that the Crusades end in 1291 with the fall of Acre, well, I don't think it makes a lot of sense, right? It is true that Europe did interiorize at one point the general failure of what the Crusade had been. There is the major crisis of the 14th century. The Pax Mongolica ends because the Mongolian Empire crushes and or splits, or whatever you want to see it like, and therefore these transcontinental routes with China are cut. And there is this idea that with the Muslims you can negotiate. Like, you don't really need to just fight them, and that's it. And there are certain European jurists that start basically saying that the Muslims are even entitled of owning certain lands. There is a deep secularization in that century in general in European culture. So yeah, that is evidently true. But I even made some videos on early Ottoman history, from exactly from about the 13th to 14th century and the 15th. And you realize, I don't remember the title, but if you go in, I created an Ottoman history playlist, and it's I don't remember how it's called, but it's easy to find. But well, there is at one point discuss what were the odds for the Ottomans to emerge from Anatolia if they hadn't directly backed by the Christians. I'm talking literally about the Western Europeans. Like, if you look at how the Ottoman Empire emerges during those centuries until the Civil War, we're talking up to the mid 15th century, so very very late in time. The Ottomans were literally a fabrication of the Western Europeans, and I'm not kidding. We're talking about, I don't know, the Hospitallary Order literally paying the Ottomans to sort of stay alive, because they needed them at the moment to compensate the political situation there. It's dramatic. Basically, simply the Westerners sat there watching the Ottoman Empire growing, and literally doing nothing about it. Even though at the beginning they could wipe them out in the blink of an eye, literally. And when you see this, you realize we have to, we have to get rid of certain mindsets. I think when we look at even how these processes of attacks and invasion happen, because you realize it has basically nothing to do with a dichotomy like Crusaders versus Muslims. It's and this is known to anyone that studies seriously these things. I mean, at normal could be the first year of university, right? It was effectively messed up in an incredible way. It was extremely complicated. And when I make these videos, I try to be, in fact, as vocal as I can about that, because I think it's very interesting and useful more than else. Then what we have, what can we say more about the Italians? Their essential lack of cohesion, right? As we were saying at the beginning of the video, the Italians basically, like, it's funny because when they came outside of Italy, everybody kind of called them in the same way. Like, the Italians were the Lombards. They were called like this by the Arabs. They were called by the other Europeans. That's what they were. And when they were out, they felt themselves to be so. Then when he came back to Italy, that didn't have any sense anymore, because, you know, each city was a different state. They had their own laws, their own jurisdiction, their own district. You know, they would behave like that. And especially the maritime republics as such had this mental projection on the sea horizon, literally, right? Venetians, Pisans, Genoese had a very different mindset from the rest of the Italians. Like, the Pisans a little bit were kind of closer, in the sense that they had kind of a terrestrial district as well, in which they waged kind of terrestrial military operations. The others basically had, I mean, Genoa had it, because Genoa controlled all Liguria. I even made a video on the development of Genoese hinterland, but it's all a mountainous area, so sometimes there were basically civil wars between the same Genoese noble families that were very... Genoa has a relatively low level of centralization, unlike Venice. So basically, Genoese political culture is very privatized, we can say, and therefore, at a certain point, it can happen that a civil conflict within Genoa engulfs the whole freaking Liguria as a consequence. So there's a lot of warfare, usually amphibious one, all these castles on the coast, etc. But there's not true hinterland. There's not a flat land. There's not a fertile plain. Nothing. Venice, renowningly, is built over islands and surrounded by a lagoon. Basically, there was no way at the time even to to invade Venice. They had tried that even very early in time, at the time of Charlemagne. Um, Charlemagne's sons Pippin died of malaria trying to capture Venice. The only ones who would almost manage to do that in the late 14th century would be the Genoese, via sea, in fact, importantly. But Venice is kind of a tough nut to crack, and they are able to repel the Genoese and eventually to even win on the long run. So these cities are specifically not interested in creating an interland, right? Venice will have to do it later on in the 15th century to counter the Milanese expansionism in the Po Valley, but that's the only reason, right? It had depended just on the city, they would have simply, remained just about the sea and nothing else. So I think that especially in these in the case of these cities, that there wasn't a great deal of solidarity, because basically conquering them was logistically impossible. So they played this all on the almost impossible, at least was an enormous thing, and it didn't even have much sense. It was much easier to pay these guys for lending, for renting the ships, and that's it, right? It was much easier for everybody. But they simply cared just about the sea and the money. The money in the sea. The Venetians had this right of their doge, their duke, essentially. With the marriage of the sea, they threw a ring, like during marriage, during the sea, to symbolize the fact that Venice is the sea, and there is nothing else in this regard, right? So it's really important. It's important to look at the mindset of these people to understand what they were doing. The other Italians weren't like that. Like the other Italians built, for example, a lot of leagues. They did fight together on some account. They were more exposed evenly to other kind of more regular terrestrial warfare. They had different mindsets in a certain regard. Always kind of quarreling, fighting against each other, but also effective, but in a different way. But to the eyes of, for example, the Bishop Jacques of Vitry, right, this mutual hostility was a big deal. In fact, the bishop wrote at the time, referred to the Italians in general, that in the Crusader states that they would be very terrible to the Saracens if they would cease from their jealousy and avarice and would not continually fight and quarrel with each other. But, ... they more often join battle against one another than against the treacherous infidel. Now, this is a beautiful quote, but it's in fact a misjudgment in general. I mean, yes, of course this was true, but what was the point at the time of fighting against the Saracens? In a broader, of course the Crusader states were fighting to survive in that context. The Saracens were the next land rebel. What did the Italians care at that point? No Saracen could invade them. They cared only about their business, right? And that's an important cultural difference that exists here between a Frenchman, for example, and an Italian. In terms of culture, vision of politics, etc., institution, and here the bishop doesn't see that. For them, it's not a big deal, right? And there is a bit, I can't say of hypocrisy in this, but the Crusader states would actually fight against each other quite often in the same measure, we can say. But what is important of this quote is rather the fact that the Italians altogether are perceived as an enormous force that was indeed split, or at least, gone wasted for the strategic aims of the Crusader states, because the Italians were essentially treasuring their wealth. They were capitalists. They were investing in other markets. They were doing something different that evidently didn't help a big deal, or at least for what they could in potential, which was enormous, literally enormous. and we have seen it just with the amount of ships that they can mobilize, which not even a kingdom could, right? And that's the thing. So in this sense, actually, Jacques of Vitry is a very good observer, right? He understands the point, but he disagrees with the mindset, right? And it's very realistic in the assessment. And this is really important, but this is something you see even later on. What do you think? I don't know. What was the second largest military in Europe after the Kingdom of France in the, I don't know, the 1330s? The De La Scala lordship in northeastern Italy. Like literally, they had the amount of money and troops that no other power in Europe had after France. Now, I wonder how many people know about the De La Scala in the first place. That's the overlooking that I'm talking about. I think Europeans largely do not know their history today. As Westerners, we really suck given the amount of history that we have and that we totally ignore. I mean, it's disgusting, and especially when you consider that effectively a large amount of what was going on in Europe at the time passed literally through these polities here. Right, and I don't know whether we will, lots of things are happening right now that evidently are quite upsetting, but I think at one point we'll have to sit to a table, at least here in Europe, and wondering, like, when there will be a European school, what the hell will teach our children? Like, this is a problem we have in Europe. I don't know, like, it's kind of unique in its kind as a continent, generally speaking, because others had different stories, different that are even more positively, frameable into a kind of a general narrative, right? With Europe, it's really a big problem because I don't think we are particularly prone to acknowledge, an historical awareness on the ground of what we have been taught, really, like. This is a great problem. It partly passes through nationalism, but it's not just that. It's also objectively a problem of political interests, given what should be the United States of Europe. That's a big question, and it's also a very difficult topic in general. Maybe one day we can discuss it, but we do need to recover what was, I think, the most important part of our past. If we don't pass from that, if we don't pass from a common root, if we don't pass from the acknowledgement that, especially medieval, and that's why medieval history is shamefully overlooked, because medieval history is probably the single most important part of history to understand the rest of history. I'm not really kidding. Right here, I'm a bit revealing you the presumptions of our craft. But basically, as medievalists, we think that we are the best historians ever because basically, and objectively though, what happened in the Middle Ages is dramatically more complicated as a narrative, right? Than which is what historians do, in fact, they have to make at one point, right? Than all the other eras, right? I mean, it's obvious that, I don't know, the contemporary age as a system is more complicated, no doubt, but that the contemporary age is also difficult for other reasons. But I mean, medieval history puts you in front of certain realizations that oblige you not to, I can't say to categorize sharply, but not to always be aware that there's more to know, and that approximations are never satisfying. And this is a period in history where you really want to look at what Europe is still today, when the Middle Ages are really one of the most important, I don't want to say more important than the ancient world, but at least at the same level of importance, at least, right? And I want to be moderate here, not to sound partial in this regard, but we did pass through this, right? We can't exclude. And just to conclude this video on a sad note, and a kind of a devastating note, and that's exactly what we need to do when you look at history, is that Jacques Vitry was right. And if you think, for example, the bloody civil wars, or such as, for example, the War of the Saint Sabas in Acre in 1259, in which allegedly, albeit improbably, 20,000 Venetians, Genoese, and other Italians died. Italians and non-Italians alike, but still in this major, this war actually was backed actively by Venice, was backed by the Templars, if I'm not wrong. The others were backed better. So you understand it's a bit more complicated, but objectively these clashes between Italians sucked into them lots of other people, lots of other powers that at this point were obviously massively interested in these clashes, because this war was exactly for the control of Acre itself, right? So naturally the last avampost, I mean, even though it was about to remain literally the last Crusader avampost in the Near East, but I mean, this disruptive, apparently disruptive conflicts, out of which, however, came out largely, as we were saying before, Europe we know. Because these clashes, even when we see at the Middle Ages, we were talking about it the other day, looking at the flourishing of Europe between the 11th and 13th century. Well, yeah, we can read it as a kind of a positive period, like almost as a progressive one, but we have to acknowledge that a lot of wars and epidemics and other structural, systemic, let's say better, failures were going on, ever more complexly. So when we look at these clashes in here, we wonder, why didn't all these Europeans unite and fight against the Saracens to reconquer everything? Well, because they had different interests that evidently had nothing to do with the original thing of going there to recuperate the holy places and all that thing. Because evidently there were more important things for them. And we can't use this as, oh no, our team lost. Oh man, it sucks. It's all fault of these guys who were killing each other. It doesn't make sense. You have to understand as a historian what the hell pushed these people to kill each other en masse, like here, in the face of a major threat coming from now. Acre would fall in like 30 years, right? So that's where you have to find the answers of history, and they're not anecdotal. There were quite concrete reasons, pretty valid reasons that you would have followed yourself in order for this to have happened. So after all, this could, trigger other further considerations on the whole thing of the Crusades in general. But once again, we have to distinguish the potential of what we wish things had gone like, because we live in the 21st century, from what people actually had in mind at the time, in a world that they understood much better than we do. So all of these geniuses that figured out that, I don't know, how to solve the problem, right? Do you think you know better than, I don't know, an hospitalier of the 13th century what the world at the time really was, and you kind of found the best solutions and you wouldn't know how to enforce that? Well, good luck with that. You must have a lot of optimism. Well, alright, so I think for today we can stop here. We will naturally keep talking about these topics, but the Crusades, medieval Italy, lot of stuff that can be naval history. I created a playlist on it, by the way, and it's not that I'm particularly expert on naval affairs. As a matter of fact, I don't understand much about maritime stuff, but I did read my share of stuff about naval warfare in the Middle Ages, so maybe one day can dip it a bit the subject. Alright, so for today we stop here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like. or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.